No problem.
West Indies have announced their World Cup squad. I think it's pretty unbalanced. There's a few key omissions. We're going to go through this, discuss it all on Wrongs with Weston.
On that note, I'd like to welcome everyone on this episode of Wrong Ones with Weston. We had quite a blast the last time around. We discussed a lot of mythbusters. We discussed England's squad, and as promised, we are also going to add another section which we had discussed the last time, wherein we'll take questions from the fans. And we've got quite a few of those questions, and we'd really like to thank everyone for that response. But like Dan said, we'll first begin by analyzing the squad of West Indies for the World T20. So Dan, your first thoughts on the squad?
Personally, I'm not a massive fan of the squad that's been selected, as perhaps a few people might anticipate. Obviously, we see that there's a lot of key omissions. The likes of Pollard, Russell, Narine, key omissions from the squad. We've seen that Narine at this point in time, we've seen it in CPL this summer, we've seen it in 100 this summer, is bowling as well as he ever has. And he balances up the side well as a capable batter as well who can hit. Obviously, Andre Russell, probably not quite the player he was a year or two or three ago, but still an exceptional world-class talent who can win the match single-handedly on his day. And you need these type of players in World Cups where a lot of the time, especially if you're an underdog, you might be 40-60 underdog or 45-55 underdog. You need these guys who can turn up and take the game away from the opposition. Now, I know for sure, I don't need to have inside info from any team's thought process to know that every single team in this tournament is delighted that Andre Russell is not playing for the West Indies in this tournament. It's as simple as that. And so because of that, because of those omissions, and a few of the others like Shafane Rutherford, who wasn't selected either, there's what I think is quite an unbalanced feel to this West Indies group. So you've got a very much a left-hander bias at the top of the order, which is going to happen, I think, regardless of who you pick in the squad. It's probably less of an issue than a right-hander bias, where you can use a lot of frontline options turning the ball away from you. But obviously with the left-hander bias, you're looking at off spinners for the opposition as a matchup, and there's not really any team who has like a real specialist off spinner. Usually it's guys like the Maxwells of this world who will come in as from the batting group, or Moeen Ali, who will bowl that off spinner as that matchup against the lefties. So it's very left-hander heavy at the top of the order. The next thing is, I think, that it lacks batting depth. So what we saw a little bit of is that in the last World Cup, West Indies lost heavily to England early in the tournament. They got rolled real cheap, and I made the point at the time on another show that the worst thing they could do was panic. They have to stay true to their strengths. They have to. Throughout the years in T20, they've won playing this clear template of just, we're going to hit more boundaries than you, and if we lose, so be it. And it's not just their strategy; it's a good strategy, and it's the right strategy for them to adopt. But then they started picking guys like Roston Chase. Lendl Simmons played, I think, one of the worst T20 innings of all time. I think it was something like 25 or 40 balls or something like that.
Yeah.
And you can't do that. You can't overreact and go from one extreme to the other. You have to have this clear plan, clear playing strategy, and stick with it. I mean, you've picked the players in the squad to do that strategy, but then you're then asking them to do an about turn and play completely differently. And so for me, what they should be doing is packing their team full of attacking high intent batters, but batting really deep. So if you look at a potential team they could have picked, if you had the Ryans, the Russells, the Pollards of this world, all playing for them, you could have a team with Romario Shepherd at number 9, and Akil Hussain at number 10 or something like that, which would just be insane depth. It would be amazing. And that's exactly what you need to have if you're going to play that ultra-aggressive style. They don't have that so much now. Yes, Hussain at 9, potentially, or Alzaro Joseph at 10 can bat. They can, but Joseph's not, I wouldn't say, is a particular hitter. You're looking at potentially a lineup with Holder at 6 or 7, which I think is far too high when you look at his balls per dismissal figures over the last couple of years. You also potentially having to shoehorn another batter into the group, Brandon King or Johnson Charles. And the Charles inclusion, I think, is a strange one as well, because he last played a T20 international 7 years ago, and now he's 33. So what's changed from the ages of 26 to 33? Is it just, have they just overreacted on a few performances this year in the CPL and say, oh, okay, well now he's like had a huge career turnaround at the age of 33? Well, I don't think he has, and I think that there's a big issue for him against spin in particular. So that would be a concern for me if he was to play. But then he may well play as a right-hander to kind of balance up that top order of left-handers. The other squad players, the squad depth I think is weak. So you look through the likely bench and you say Yannick Carrier is such a weird inclusion into their squad, because how on earth do you pick a player who's 30 years old who hasn't played in the CPL as a local player since 2016? He's played 4 CPL matches in his entire career. And the 2 in 2016, but 1 over in each match. That's so weird. So either the selectors have got it right and everyone else has got it wrong, or the other way around. And I think I know where I'd probably lie on that one.
If I can come in, like you, I'm also a little surprised that they've gone for Yannick Carrier over someone like Hayden Walsh, and they've gone for Odean Smith over Romario Shepherd, because I felt that Romario, like for the position where they are going to take up in the 11, which is probably batting at 8 or 9, I feel that someone like Romario Shepherd is a slightly better bowler, and even I think as a batter as well, someone like Romario Shepherd seems to have a few more shots than Odean Smith. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that you're right in saying that Shepherd is more of a traditional batter, if you like, in terms of having more options, whereas I think Smith is more of a brute force power hitter. Now, on occasions, both of those type of styles can work. Could there be space for both of them in the squad? But I do agree with you that Shepherd at the moment is more of a finished article in terms of his bowling, just in terms of one ability and 2-phase production. But Smith's power hitting is a really not thing that's nice to have as well. And I think that you could easily make a case for a smartly selected squad having both of them in it.
So, Dan, is it fair to say that the case with West Indies is complete opposite to that of Pakistan? Like how Pakistan is a bowling heavy side, West Indies should embrace the betting heaviness of their squad depth and just pick everyone who can bat, and have zero care about defending anything or chasing anything.
Absolutely, yeah. So if it wouldn't be that difficult to say, as I said earlier, to structure a team where you have Akil Hussain at number 10 and pure hitters 1 to 9. And for me, that would be the best template for West Indies to succeed in this tournament. If they're going to go into matches as a slight underdog, they need to make them as high variance as possible, and filling their team with hitters is the only way you can do that.
Yeah, and talking about right-handers who can bat with intent, is Brandon King the best option that they could have had, or is there someone else? I mean, they would have wanted some right-hander to be in the top 5, but right now all they have is Brandon King.
They just don't have enough right-handers in that top 5 group. Someone like Rodman Powell is another option for them as a top 5 batter, but I think he struggles a lot against spin to start with. So I prefer to bat him lower down. So I've seen he has a very polarized style of play. So he looks to just like block or hit. He doesn't ever try and do anything different really. So I mean I think that his kind of percentage of shots playing like a kind of forward defensive is probably one of the highest that I've seen. But then he also has a high power game as well. So against spin, he might try to take some time to get set. So that's another player who perhaps be better off batting a little bit lower down with that sort of entry point of maybe, I don't know, 13-ish, 14-ish overs or something like that.
So, apart from that, the one thing that I also want to ask you is that given the pitches that you see in CPL largely and in West Indies, and the pitches that you might encounter in Australia. They're more or less 180 degrees apart, because in CPL, especially over the last couple of years, we have seen that pitches have gone from being slow to slower, and even being slowest. I remember there was this odd game in CPL where a score of 92 was defended, and not because the other team was bowled out, but they were able to restrict the opposition to 89. Right. What I have personally seen is that that has affected somewhat the game against extreme pace bowling for the West Indies batters. Do you think they have that covered now with the squad that they have, or do you think a lot of heavy lifting against pace might have to be done by the likes of Hetmyer and Powell and maybe Evan Lewis?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case actually, Gokar. Yeah, so those guys are going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting. I look at the likely lineup that I put up earlier, and you think that Lewis, Pooran, Hetmyer, Powell, a lot of those guys are going to have really good tournaments for the West Indies to succeed in Australian conditions. Now, what if you're looking at perhaps very micromanaged selection strategies? What you could do if you're worried about those kind of pitch issues, and as you say, a 180 turn from the conditions in the West Indies to conditions in Australia, is look at the conditions in Australia, find out what type of batters have thrived in Australian conditions. I don't necessarily even mean West Indies players. I'm talking about just generally what type of players do well in Australia. What options work better than others, in as a shot options in Australia compared to West Indies, and you can then find players in your own domestic group who perhaps fit those criteria as a horses for courses selection in Australia, if that's a particular concern that a country, be it West Indies or anybody else, is worried about.
But Dan, isn't it too late in the day for doing such an analysis and then picking a squad? I mean, if there has to be a vision for this sort of selection process.
Well, this is the whole point, Smash. I think that you're absolutely right. There's got to be this long-term, short, medium, long-term vision, and the short-term vision a lot of time has got to be aligned with the medium and the long-term vision. And this is where I don't think that this has potentially happened in the West Indies selection policy, in terms of picking Charles for the first time in 7 years at the age of 33, picking Carrier, who has barely ever played CPL as a local. And Raymond Rifer as well. I mean, this guy's 31 years old. He's bowled 11 balls all season in the CPL, 12 balls a match in his CPL career. Career strike rate of 115 odd. Yes, it's a bit high this year, but it was 107 last year. Is a few matches this year enough evidence to suggest that he's got this late career renaissance? I don't think that that's the case. And so, for me, it seems that they've gone with a lot of recency bias, a lot of who's done well in the first few matches of the CPL potentially, and go, okay, well, we're going to go with that, and that's not a long-term strategy at all. And I think that again, it brings into question, I think, a lot of the people who do selection jobs around the world. How qualified are they actually to do those jobs? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, maybe they are trying to identify their own Dinesh Karthik.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, just for the ease of our viewers, let's get cracking on your West Indies starting 11 once, and then maybe we'll have a few more questions after we set that down. So, what do you think is the 11 they'll start with, or they should start with?
I think that they'll probably go with something like Evan Lewis, Kyle Mayers, either Brandon King or Johnson Charles as a kind of that spare batter, just to push everyone else down the order a little bit, really. Pooran, Hetmyer, Powell, Holder, and then the all-rounders, or hold the all-rounder with Smith, Hussain, Alzara Joseph, and Obed McCoy. Now, that's light on spin options. A lot of heavy lifting is going to have to be done by Akil Hussain. Now, I think it's probably, you'd say that Holder is one too high, even at 7. And there's probably a longer tail than I would like as well with Joseph and McCoy, and again, not a top sort of 3 that convinces me that much, but as I say, it's really Lewis, Powell, Pooran, Hetmyer, Smith, and Holder, and Hussain, the 7 key players, I think, who are really going to have a massive tournament here.
There's also an issue of who their sixth bowler could be. Like the only option that they have, I think, in the top six who can bowl is someone like Kyle Myers, unless Nicholas Pooran also starts rolling his arm over. And even in their top five bowlers, one of them is Odean Smith, who has struggled to complete his quota of overs a lot of times. So that is also a concern. I see that there.
Yeah, so the only way that they can really address that, I think, is by picking another bowler and lengthening their tail and Sheldon Cottrell, because Rifer is definitely not a fifth or sixth bowler. And if you don't pick Cottrell to address that problem, you're picking a 30-year-old leg spinner who's barely played in domestic cricket for 6 years. So for me, that's the only solution. So if you bring in like a Cottrell for an Odean Smith, then you have an even longer lineup, and you have to play with more fear with the bat as well. So again, whatever the hybrid combination is that they go with, there's going to be implications of that on their team balance.
Okay, despite the problems that you see with their lineup, do you see them struggling in the qualifiers? Like, do you think that the likes of Scotland, Ireland, or Zimbabwe have a chance of upsetting West Indies in the qualifiers, or do you think that despite everything, West Indies should sail smoothly into the Super 12s from the qualifiers?
I'm reluctant to say sail smoothly, but I think that they should really have enough in this group to get past that type of opposition. I think Ireland are probably the strongest out of those teams. I'm not massively convinced about the level of Scotland right now. A lot of players potentially going towards the wrong end of the age curve there in their group as well, or bringing in new players who perhaps haven't had that opportunity at a high level tournament. And I just think that the West Indies should have too much for that, and it would be a major shock if they didn't get past those to that type of opposition for sure.
So, I mean, after diving so deep in the West Indies squad, let's move to the section that all of us here and the fans as well love the most, which is Mythbusters. Or the first topic of discussion that we have today is, Dan, do you think the Yorker is a fast bowler's most important weapon in the death as a death bowler?
Okay, so for my view is that it's a mandatory weapon for a fast bowler to have. So I do a lot of work with bowlers. I do a lot of work at assessing bowlers in terms of opposition analysis as well. And what I do see quite a lot is a pace bowler who's really only comfortable bowling a good length or back of a length. So good length would be like kind of 6 to 8 meters, back of a length would be 8 to 10 meters or something like that. And they're not comfortable going any fuller than that in terms of Yorker lengths at all. And the reason why that is because they're so scared of missing the Yorker length and going over pitching, going full toss, or giving the batter a half volley. And so that margin for error a lot of the time is very, very small for a bowler, and that's why they've got that fear. So the problem is that if you only bowl length or back of a length as a bowler because you're scared of bowling a Yorker, then you become very predictable as well. And the batters can, if you prepare a batter to know that they don't really go Yorkers very often, sub 1% of the time or whatever, then the batter can adapt to that as well, and that's useful information for the batter to counter that bowler. Now, for me, Yorker is a key part of a bowler's armoury, but don't expect it to be executed on a regular basis. If you can execute a Yorker 30-40% of the time, I think that's actually probably a really decent percentage. You look at some of the best bowlers of the Yorker around. Quite a low profile good Yorker bowler in England is Luke Fletcher at T20 in T20. Now his numbers bowling Yorkers are exceptional, and he hits them a lot more than the vast majority of players, but he still probably misses slightly more than he hits. But because he's so good at when he hits, that's a fantastic option for him. Now, for me, that's the big trade-off. Which you've got to rationalise. So the flip side would be someone like Timel Mills, who bowls back of a length a lot of the death and doesn't go Yorker, but he's got that extra pace and height as well that makes a big difference for him. But on the whole, you are going to have to try and embrace the variance with the Yorker. It's the best option for you at the death in terms of economy, right? But it's also the one which is the highest risk as well. So you can also look at it from like match situations as well. So let's say, for sake of argument, you've got 6 runs to defend off the last over in a T20 match. Well, you're probably better off just trying to bowl Yorkers non-stop, because you've got to embrace the variance. You've got to go high risk, and you've got to hope that you can execute those skills at the right time. But if you're defending, say, I don't know, 15 and over or something like that, you're probably better off not going Yorkers so much, because if you miss your margin for error is you could get smashed going either length that you've missed. So yeah, it's always a tough one, and it's probably always never true to say it's a batter's game.
Yeah. So as tough as nailing the Yorker.
So from what I understood here is basically what you're saying, that if you have nothing to lose, then it's best to go for the Yorkers. But if you have a margin to play around it, then maybe you can reconsider, which I feel is very similar for spinners as well, right? When spinners have nothing to lose, it is best for them to go for a high variance option, that is try and buy out a wicket by flighting the delivery. But if there is enough margin, then maybe they are better off bowling defensively. Is it somewhat like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you've got to work out like how much variance or how much standard deviation you're prepared to tolerate in that given match situation. Yeah, exactly that.
Another question that I have, with respect to Yorkers is that, do you think sometimes it could just be, a matter of confidence for a particular bowler, on that particular day, that they might just feel that today my Yorkers are landing well, so I'll go for Yorkers a lot more regardless of the situation? Or do you think it's more of situation oriented for even the best of the bowlers in the business?
Yeah, I think more a bit of both, but more situation oriented. But also, what you tend to find if you're looking at confidence with Yorkers is actually bowlers tend to lose their confidence in the Yorker over a certain period of time. I don't want to name names of players who that's happened to, but it's quite profound actually how some players' Yorker percentages have dropped over recent years, and that's coincided with perhaps them being less effective in a T20 format as the years have gone by. And I've spoken to several players about this type of thing actually, and if a player comes to you and they ask you for their information and really no holds barred, you can have those type of discussions with them, and you can say, what, right, 5 years ago when you were at X level, you were bowling, I don't know, 5% Yorkers at the death, and now you're like 0.5% Yorkers at the death, or something like that, and you can say, okay, well, that's clearly changed. You're now not keeping the batter guessing so much. It might be worth you mixing up your options a little bit more. And 5% of balls at the death is still maybe 1 in 2 matches you're bowling if you're bowling 2 overs at the death or something like that. So, it's not a lot to ask for someone to do that as a death bowler. So, so if someone's reducing their Yorker percentage because they've lost confidence, then that's something that perhaps a bowler would not need to be aware of as well. So there's positive areas of confidence, there's negative areas of confidence for sure. So yeah, I think it's a bit of everything really.
Moving on to the I think we've discussed enough about Yorkers, but moving on to the next mythbuster. A very common cliche when there are big tournaments around is that you have to factor in experience. Do you think sometimes experience gets overstated, while selecting a squad, and sometimes it's just that people think that experience can make up for skill? Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's just one of those grandstanding myths that have continued since the game has become global and there's been a lot more analysis into the game?
I love this question because it's it's something that I actually pretty strongly believe in. I think that experience is fairly overrated in cricket. Certainly, I don't think that it's a commodity that you want to overpay for in an auction environment, for example, or a draft environment. Now, what I find is that it's very similar in terms of the cliche that's used for experience as would be momentum in a match in terms of from a commentary perspective. So the commentators they because they, for want of a better phrase, they seem to adore the veteran players, the guys who are the big names who are perhaps not as good as they used to be, but the commentators still talk them up as if they're absolute superstars playing at the top of their game. They will be like, look, experience when they do play well. Look, experience is key. Look, he's got them over the line here. But what they don't say is the time that he's chewed up 30 balls for 25 and got out and leaving their team 16 and over. Well, experience didn't do much good then, did it? So it's always a balance thing. I think having players around who experience different environments and different strategies and different formats, different tournaments, whatever it will be, is can never be a negative. But I wouldn't overpay for it at all. Now you've got situations. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Dan Christian was captain of Nottinghamshire in the T20 Blast in England, and he came out with this well quoted phrase from an article and said, "Old guys win stuff." Well, they won the tournament. Okay, well, that's fine, but there's also this problem where with roster construction, you have to guard against the players getting too old all at the same time, or all declining at similar points. And I felt that this year his Notts team did do that. So I felt that they were like maybe hiding 5 in the field, and they weren't running many twos, and so maybe they had to hit 20 more boundary runs than the other team to just be on par. And so you can easily go from this old guys win stuff to having players who are liabilities in the fields and not taking quick singles. I think maybe in certain phases of their evolution and development over the last 15 years, we've seen similar situations with CSK, for example, as well, where they've gone through those kind of patches as well. And I think you've always got to be aware of where the next decline is coming from and be proactive at anticipating the decline. International teams generally haven't done that recently. So you look at England now; they've got a very much an aging group. Australia as well, similar. And these teams are going to have to do a lot of surgery after the World Cup, I think, particularly if they don't get to the latter stages.
So I have 2 follow-up questions, Dan. Is the thought, or should the thought process be different for leagues as compared to ICC tournaments in terms of choosing players who are experienced? And second, is there a trade-off between skills and decision making? Because sometimes what is generally believed that more the experience, the better our decision making skills at a crucial juncture. Is that the trade-off, or is it just it is irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that there's probably an argument to say that they make better decisions at certain times. Older players I'm talking about, but is that enough to indulge a player who's clearly not at the peak of their talents? So, and that would be my counter argument to that. Certainly not at a high price point in the auction or draft environment. Sometimes we've seen guys get picked up right at the top of the order and in a draft, and realistically, are they going to contribute much with the bat or ball? No. Are they a decent captain? Yeah, probably. But is that too much? Now, you could say the argument, well, if you pick them up like 2/3 of the way down in a draft, and you're picking them up for value of experience and captaincy, then that's absolutely fine, and that becomes much more of a value proposition. But at the top of the price point, no, I don't think so.
Coming to a similar thought process where you've just said that sometimes players are picked but they don't contribute that much. Do you think that if that sometimes teams can also carry a player just because they also have the brand value of their franchise in mind, or do you think it's something that purely dependent upon skill as well, because we have seen that in the IPL as well, that there are players who have been on a downward curve in terms of performance, but teams still tend to value them, right?
Mhm.
Maybe as captains, maybe as star batters, or maybe just as players who can bring in crowds or who can bring in that connect with the franchise. What's your thought on this?
So I've probably discussed this kind of thing more with random people on Twitter than any other topic in cricket, and my point is clear, or my stance is clear, is that if you're assembling a team in terms of as a drafter and an auction analyst, your objective is to create a team which has the highest expectation to win a tournament. It's not to make money for your owner or whatever it might be. It's to produce a winning team, and those are the decisions that ultimately you do get judged on in that role. So you can't compromise in those perspectives, because otherwise people don't know which players you sign and which players you didn't sign or whatever it is, and it gets very messy. So for me, it's all about maximizing your win percentage chance and picking the players who can contribute as much on the pitch as possible. The problem is, as you say, Gurkharat, is that there's a lot of other factors that do muddy the waters to some degree, and you will get players signed because of who they are, or brand awareness, or marketing purposes, or whatever it might be. Gets people in the crowd, sells shirts, brings in income from YouTube or whatever it might be. But ultimately, all that does is make the owner richer, because you can't reinvest that money into your squad, because you've got a fixed budget of however so many crores at the auction that you can spend, and everyone pretty much maxes out that budget. It's not like anyone spends half the budget because they can't afford to spend any more. Everyone spends pretty much the whole of the budget, and so why would you take a decision that doesn't benefit you on the pitch when you're going to spend all the money anyway, that you can't reinvest that money? Now, if you're going to say, okay, well, I want to earn $300 million because I want to build training centres in this part of the world and that part of the world and that part of the world to try and develop players for the franchise so we can find players for everybody else, well, then that's a different argument completely. And you can say, okay, well, actually, that is worth investing that money in. But on the whole, I don't think that's really happening or going to happen. So for me, it's just about maximising that chances. The chances of winning is critical. And I've always said as well, even if you don't buy a team for the stars, you can make a team for the stars. When we were at Birmingham Phoenix, when we signed Liam Livingstone in 2019, he wasn't really around the England setup very much. People raised eyebrows that we picked him up in the first round of the draft when everyone was picking up overseas players. And now, 3 years later on, this guy is like a superstar around the world. And you go to Phoenix home matches and it's him and Moeen Ali that the whole of the crowd wants to see after the game. Get selfies with or sign autographs or whatever it is. And and you can see someone like Will Smith becoming like that as well. So that you can make stars. You don't have to buy stars. You can make stars, and if you win matches, that's probably good enough to get crowds in a lot of the time. Everyone's going to want to see teams who play a good, attractive brand of cricket and win matches. I don't see there's a debate in that at all. And you look at the 100 over 2 seasons so far. The teams who have probably got a decent brand of cricket and have done well generally are the teams who are most supported. So you can make stars, you can build crowds by being successful. You don't have to import like a certain big name in just to give yourself that presence. I don't think.
That's actually quite an elaborative answer, because it does answer the dilemma, which sometimes is creating issues for even the fans as well, because sometimes even fans can see why a particular player has been bought, and they are always in two minds, that whether they should criticize that move because they don't see that value with that player, but should they support that move because that player benefits the team in other ways. So that's quite an elaborative answer. uh, I think now we should move on to the next myth buster. What do you think, Somesh?
Yeah, definitely. And this was not supposed to be part of this show. I mean, it just so we were having a random discussion about the England squad, and one of the questions that just immediately popped up was, why is Chris Jordan there? And someone said because he's a bowling all-rounder. And I was like, is he really a bowling all-rounder? So I thought we might as well discuss that with Dan. What does he really think about this?
Okay, so if you asked me this question 2 years ago, my answer would be actually quite different to what it is now. It's so strange because I think 2 years ago he was kind of perceived as almost like a genuine all-rounder, which was kind of crazy because his boundary percentages was so below average, and particularly below average for the phases that he was batting in. And I didn't see him as an all-rounder at all. I viewed him simply as what I would call like a bowler, is primarily a bowler but offers extra depth. That's how I would describe him. So not an all-rounder at all, just a bowler who offers a little bit of extra depth, like a 10 or a 9 or something like that at best. Now, it's actually changed a lot in the last couple of years, particularly this year. This year, Chris Jordan's boundary percentage is almost 20%, which is pretty solid. It's above average for the average batter, and it's pretty decent for the entry points that he's coming in at as well. And not just that, but he's got a really decent 6-4 ratio of less than 2. So he's hitting less than 2 fours per 6. So he's having a high percentage of his boundaries are actually for the maximum rather than for 2 runs fewer as well. So actually his batting this year is almost like he's found a new gear that he wants to try and hit. The problem for him, I think, has generally been an inability to strike well against spin. So he still should be pigeonholed as a kind of a sort of 17th over entry point or later kind of role in the side. But I think now you can definitely call him a bowling all-rounder. But the problem is I think his bowling production now is dropping off a little bit as well. Certainly this year compared to last year, we're seeing worsening boundary percentage conceded and economy, which is always driven pretty much by the boundary percentage conceded, which would be a pretty major concern for me given the fact that he turns 34 next month.
Just want to ask you something which we were discussing before on the subject of Yorkers. Do you think someone like Chris Jordan is the perfect example of why Yorker is such a high variance weapon at the death? Because you mentioned that his dot ball percentage is up there, but so is his boundary percentage. So is it purely because of the high variance or the minimal margin of error that comes with Yorkers, or do you think there's something else as well which is going wrong for him?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point actually. In terms, most games he's going to bowl 12 balls at the death, and he could bowl the same 12 balls 2 games in a row, and one set of 12 could go for 25, and the other set of 12 can go for 10, and that's the variance of the game and those fine margins. And I'm sure that any bowler will tell you that. I often spoke to bowlers and they'll say, I felt like I bowled well, but I got hit for 50 in 4 overs or something like that, or vice versa. Even they might say, they took 3 for 20, and so they walked off saying didn't think they bowled particularly well, but maybe they got a few catches on the boundary or whatever it was, and sort of they stole those figures to some degree. And I think that's the rough and the smooth and the high variance nature that we do see in professional sport, in terms of, and there's fine margins in terms of Yorkers turning into slot or 4 tosses or whatever as well, and all of that manifests itself in that kind of the variance side of things. The problem for me would be if your economy is going up and your Yorker execution percentage is going down, then that's probably going to be a problem at some stage in your career or in the short term future.
Right. So I mean, now that we have actually criticized Jordan for a few of the things, I just want to ask a tangential question to the group.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, considering all fielding positions, is he the best catcher that we have seen?
Oh, that's a question. Actually, I think his fielding has not been quite as high a standard this year when I've watched him play as in previous years. But he's certainly up there. There's some very, very good fielders now in England. Jordan Cox is an exceptional fielder. I don't think we see much of him. Very, very good young fielder. There's so many good young fielders. Garton's a good fielder as well. His teammate at Southern Brave too.
Yeah, I wanted to touch
think for
the
fast
catching
bowler,
aspect.
he's right up there.
Yeah, I mean, forget about ground fielding. but I was just more thinking from the catching lens. I mean, we've seen him take a few great cotton balls. He's fielded at slips and in the outfield as well. So, okay, moving on from Chris Jordan. So this is the new segment that we've added from this episode. This is what we're calling Viewers Corner, and we had a lot of viewers who engaged with us, and we received a feedback regarding the background music as well, and we assure you that we'll solve this out in this episode. So we will take a few questions, Dan, and I'll just get started with the first one. Yep, so we had to discuss this. So Ridham Shah goes on to ask, what's your take on the new super sub rule to be introduced in the SMAT this year? First thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm guessing that they're going to implement it in a SMAT because they want to have a view to see how it performs in advance of the IPL. I think that's pretty obvious. I love it. I actually really love it. The Big Bash have toyed around with this sub rule over recent years. I think they're getting rid of it this year, but I don't like the way that the Big Bash did it in terms of the structuring of when you can enter a player in and the certain criteria about who you can withdraw at certain stages. And I much prefer what I've seen of this one, where you could actually have a player who can make a real impact on a game, or replace a player who's already done what they needed to do in the game. I think this is much more of a proper substitution scenario. Now, for me, I think the game's been crying out for this. First of all, as well, in terms of injuries, you can only replace an injured player if they've got concussion. So it seems completely logical that if your star fast bowler pulls his hamstring in the first over, then it seems archaic that you can't replace him. And like how football was maybe like 60 years ago or something like that. Now you can use like 5 subs in football. So yeah, I mean, from an injury perspective and from a strategic perspective, I'm all for anything that gives the team that I'm working for a potential for a strategic advantage over the opposition. And I think that this does that. So for me, yeah, I'm all for it.
We do have a follow-up about the same question. Let me pull that up 1 minute. Yep. So Rajdeep Das adds, does the new rule will promote the role of face specialists?
I think definitely. So what you will want on your bench will be an array of players who can offer that point of difference. And again, I think that's where the Big Bash struggled a little bit, because on their bench was just players who just weren't good enough for the first 11. Whereas in the IPL, you've got 4 spare overseas per team, you've got a squad of 25 or whatever it is. So you're going to have players on the bench who can perform extremely well in a given role in a given phase. And so, let's say for sake of argument, you've got a death bowling specialist on the bench, but he's not very good at bowling in other phases, for example. Well, he could be the perfect guy that you sub on with 4 overs to go for the bowling or something like that, or whatever the rules will be, however that fits into the rules, to get him those 2 overs in the phase that he's particularly confident in or has the skills to execute in that phase. On the flip side, death hitters as well. If you're running out of batters, you might want to sub in a death hitter so you can still take advantage of the death overs if you've lost a lot of early wickets. There's so much scope for tactical interventions here, and it genuinely wouldn't surprise me if this was implemented in the IPL, that it didn't go global or even extend itself to having multiple subs.
Okay, so to finish off this discussion on this impact rule, Rohan goes on to ask, is it unfair that it has happened after the mega auction? Teams would have, but it's the same for everyone, right? Yeah.
So 1, it's the same for everyone, as you say, and 2, like I said in the last sort of segment of this question, it's a 25-player squad that most IPL teams have. If you haven't got anyone who can influence a game in a short period of time in a 25-man squad that's not in the pitch, you probably didn't recruit very well to start with, and you probably shouldn't have any complaints. So I don't think it's unfair to implement it after the mega auction, but I'm sure that as if the rule does get brought into the IPL and it evolves, then we're going to see certain player valuations or role valuations for certain players change over as the next 5-10 years evolve. Definitely.
There's another question that has come in, and it's coming from Chatil Pandita Sekara. It's someone from Sri Lanka. He's asking that given the deficiencies that Asian teams have against pace and bounce, how should they approach a T20 World Cup in Australia?
Okay, so we kind of talked a bit about this in the West Indies question, I think, in terms of trying to understand what works in Australia. So, for example, if a certain bowling length is successful for the bowling team in Australia, or a bowling pace, and you've got a batter who's you can perceive to be one of your top 6 batters, but he really struggles against that length of that pace, then perhaps they're not the best player to pick for a World Cup in Australia. And there's no shame in that if you're the player. That's your skill set's not suited to those conditions. It's not like football, for example, where you're playing on the same pitch of grass around the world a lot of the time, and the dimensions of the pitch are not very different, and conditions don't really have much of a deciding factor. Cricket's completely different. It's a game of conditions, and like we were saying earlier, T20 in the CPL is not far being a different sport to the team. So T20 in the Big Bash, for example. So it's only right that you go horses for courses. So this is where I feel like perhaps if you're from a country that doesn't have a lot of experience of those Australian pitches, you've got to do a lot more due diligence to understand which players are going to succeed or struggle in those type of conditions. And again, this all goes back down to having a really thorough and professional selection strategy and process where there's no bias or anything like that. It's just literally understanding and making evidence-based decisions as to what players are going to likely be the best group of players to succeed given the task in hand.
Okay, so I'll just ask a follow-up relevant to the similar topic. So then, how should a team counter certain deficiencies which cannot be overcome? Let's say, for example, hypothetically, if the analysis say that bowlers with high pace generally do better in Australian conditions than ones or medium paces, but if the team doesn't have bowlers with high pace, how should they go about it? Should they try to manage? Obviously, they'll have to try to manage with what they have, but should they just change course and stack their team with more batting options and just don't care about bowling at all?
Well, that's a difficult question, and obviously, if you're in that situation, you're going to likely be pre-match underdog in the vast majority of cases because you don't have that bowling attack who fits those conditions. So again, like you say, maybe packing the batting order with explosive, volatile, high variance players who can play a very attacking style would be, and going with an extra batter, for example, spare batter, would be one way of dealing with it. If I'm perhaps say like a Bangladesh, for example, who obviously have very different home conditions to Australia, I might even go down because they don't really have the power hitters either. I might go down a really spin heavy route in Australia instead, primarily because boundaries are pretty big. And I've seen from watching years and years and years of the Big Bash and having a lot of data on Australian players, is that most Australian players don't play spin that well. So if I'm Bangladesh and I'm going away to Australia, I'm going to probably just give them a test of spin and hope for the best, because I don't think that there's a lot more that you can do really.
I think that was exactly what the question was, because coming from a Sri Lankan fan, I think the question, it was more from a point of view that if Sri Lanka don't have batters who can play express pace, or if they don't have a lot of bowling options who can bowl express pace, luckily they have Lahiru Kumara and Chamira who can bowl 145 plus. I think the question was coming from that point of view. Anyway, moving on to next question. There's a question by a user named Mazakia Shortleg. He's asking that where do you stand on the debate between flexibility and specialist in T20s? he's taken the context of the Indian cricket team, and he's saying that the team management keeps talking about that they want to prepare their batters for batting at all positions and be flexible in all kinds of situations. But where do you particularly stand on that debate?
I think it's very tough actually to find players who can do those jobs, because generally there's a reverse correlation between balls per dismissal and boundary percentage. So there's almost always a trade-off between attacking intent in terms of boundary percentage and stability in terms of balls per dismissal. Now, you have to be like a top 10 player in the world to really excel in both areas. You know, like a De Villiers was up there before he retired, or a Joss Butler might be up there now, for example. So you look at someone maybe over 20% boundaries, over 22 balls per dismissal. You throw that into a filter of worldwide players over a decent sample, you could probably find the amount of players on two hands at the most in terms of counting 10 players max. And that's because players generally don't have the skill set or the mindset to play both types of innings. And players who do are so rare and so valuable. The problem is that with India trying to do that, they're kind of trying to create something out of players who don't necessarily have that ability. And if we're looking at it from a really critical basis, what I've seen sometimes when they've played for the international team or as their careers have developed, players who came into the IPL as this really exciting, attacking young players who played with a lot of freedom and no fear, like Ishan Kishan or Rishabh Pant. As soon as they started to play for India, they've kind of tried to. I don't know if the players manufacturing themselves, or they've been asked to by the management, or whatever it is, or the fear of failure is too much. I don't know what it is, but they've turned themselves into this more accumulating style, and it seems so strange, because the reason why they're picked surely is because they've got that ability to play a match-winning, high intent, high boundary percentage innings, and so it's almost like I feel like it's been coached out of them to some degree. And I don't know why that is at all. But for me, I wouldn't be finding the young hitters and trying to make them play more classical. That seems to make no sense. I think you should embrace a player's strengths and not tamper with that too much. Now the problem is that, as I say, there's very few players around the world who can play. You can come in 100 for one off 9 overs and attack from ball one because that's what's needed, or come in at 50 for 3 off 8 overs and somehow haul your team up to 160. You know, they're so difficult to find those players. So I don't really see the merit of trying to create players, because that's so difficult, especially when you don't have a lot of time with players to spend with them in terms of training technique, over a short period of time that you might be with the international team, for example.
Understood. But just a follow-up question, even though I've pretty much understood what your thought process here is, but say if you had a hypothetical choice, between converting an anchor player into a hitter, or asking a player who has a high boundary percentage to turn into an anchor, what do you think is easier? Is converting an anchor into a hitter easier, or converting a hitter into an anchor easier?
I think both of them are extremely difficult. So converting a hitter into an anchor, I mean, I don't understand why anyone would want to do that anyway. And converting an anchor into a hitter, well, you're struggling in two ways potentially there. One, in terms of the power that they might not have. So you might have to train them in power. We also might have to really overhaul their mindset as well, in terms of having the mindset of wicket preservation and actually switching that to not worrying too much about wicket preservation and looking to attack instead. And that's very, very difficult. And virtually impossible. I would suggest in a lot of ways.
Okay, so to just finish off this discussion, I mean, I'll just come back to India and just want to know from you, Dan. I mean, this is now my theory. In the last two ICC tournaments, India lost two crucial games because in a very short span of time, there was a chaos that was created in the middle. I mean, is that the reason why this current management has just, they've sort of planted the chaos in normalcy just to test the waters and prepare certain players for certain situations? Maybe that is the reason why they are doing this. And if they are doing this, I mean, are they just preparing for the worst or just complicating stuff for themselves?
Well, this is where you've got to be so careful about the process, I think, because you've got it could become a similar situation to what I was discussing earlier with the West Indies in terms of overreacting into short-term events and thinking, okay, well, because this has happened in previous World Cups, we've got to prepare for it not to happen this time. But actually, there might have only been a 5% chance of that happening in the last World Cup. It just so happens that 5% manifested itself at that point in time. Doesn't mean to say that it's going to happen again in the future. So for me, the only problem is in terms of I'm sure we'll go on to this when we talk about the India World Cup squad in the future, in a future episode, is that they do kind of lack a bit of balance in terms of the top six not being offering much of a bowling option, and so therefore they have to have perhaps a longer tail than some other teams, and that can contribute in that area.
Okay, cool. So I mean, it was a very engaging discussion, and we were not able to take all the questions due to lack of time, but we'll definitely take them at some point of time in the future. So, I mean, thanks for all your questions, and just keep sending us those. So, yep, that's it from me. Gurkirat, Dan, you want to add on something?
Yeah, just that like how we added another section which was taking in questions from the fans. This is a section that will continue to keep happening, and we've also incorporated all the feedback that we got from the last episode, and we'll definitely work on it. So if you have any other questions for the next episode, or if you want us to preview a particular team first as well, do let us know. We at cricket.com make sure that we pay heed to what our viewers are saying, and that's not just true for Wrong Ones with Weston. That's true for any and every episode or any production that we put out. So that's the note that I want to end on, and I hope everyone who's watched this show or the previous one has really enjoyed it and found it insightful enough to enhance their T20 understanding.
Yeah, I just want to say as well, guys, thanks so much for all your support on social media that we've had over the last week or so. It's been pretty overwhelming. We're really keen to keep improving the show and creating more content as well. So send us your feedback, send us your questions, like Gurkirat says. Just we want to hear from you. So just as much interaction as possible. Share this show with your friends. Anything you can. Just send us as many questions or feedback as you possibly can. It'd be great to hear from you.
Yep, and with that, we'll see you next Tuesday on Wrong Ones with Weston.
Tuesday at 8 p.m. Keep that in mind.